The wind that sweeps across the Danish countryside carries an ancient voice, filled with secrets and sorrow. It hums through the heather, whispers over the frozen lakes, and moves like breath through the empty barns long abandoned to time. In this land where twilight seems endless, the veil between the living and the dead thins with every dusk. The same fog that rolls over the moors can swallow a traveler whole, leaving only the echo of their footsteps behind. This is where the stories of the Nattravnen begin. A raven so large it blots out the moon when it flies. To the people of old Denmark, it was not a tale of fancy, but a deadly omen hovering at the edge of the visible world. The peasants believed that where the Nattravnen flew, death soon followed. It was a messenger of endings, a herald of calamities such as famine or plague, or of the silent passing of someone loved. You can almost feel its wings before you see them, vast shadows draped across the cold fields. The air grows still, and the distant toll of the church bell trembles with a warning long forgotten. Imagine standing alone on a Danish heath beneath a sky swollen with clouds. You raise your eyes, and there, hovering like a torn piece of the night itself, is the dark form that generations feared to name aloud. The Nattravnen is said to travel during tempests, its wings slicing through wind and rain as if the elements bowed before its fury. When lightning flashes, a pair of crimson eyes pierce the sky like burning coals. Some say these eyes are made from the souls it has taken, each spark a trapped spirit that once belonged to a crying child. Others claim that what glows is not anger, but unbearable sorrow, the burden of countless departed who were never blessed by holy water. The legend does not come from empty superstition. It is rooted in centuries of grief, in an age when life was fragile and death was a constant companion. In those times, children often perished before their first winter, and baptism was not always possible. And so whispers grew of what would happen to a soul unbaptized. If no priest had sanctified it, the spirit would wander in darkness, denied both heaven and peace. Some believed these shards of innocence merged into something terrible and magnificent. That something was the Nattravnen, a body of vengeance and despair given wings. It is said to rise from the graves of forgotten infants, its feathers woven from their collective mourning. When it flies, its wings do not flap in sound, but in silence, as though the night itself is gasping. Villagers crossing the fields at dusk would drop to their knees, covering their heads, praying that its gaze might pass over them. There are stories of mothers who hurried to the church in the middle of storms, desperate to ring the bells so their children would not be taken. The bell's echo was hope transformed into sound, a barrier against the crushing weight of guilt and loss. The Nattravnen does not attack in the way of beasts. It does not tear or bite. Its power lies in foretelling, in haunting the skies before death descends upon the land. It appears just before the first cough of plague, before the wheat blackens in the field, before the first ship sinks off the coast. It is not evil. It is simply the shadow that follows inevitability. But the peasants were not philosophers. They did not think of cosmic balance or the metaphors of despair. They only knew that where the Nattravnen's shadow touched, someone would not live to see morning. You have to remember that this was a world steeped in ritual and silence. Every action held meaning, every sound a possible omen. For them, the cry of a raven at midnight could turn courage to ash. And yet, there is beauty in the telling of it. The creature belongs to the oldest language of fear, the language that explains storms, death, and grief, when no priest or scholar can offer comfort. If you listen carefully along the marshes of Jutland or the deep forests near Zealand, you may still hear that spectral call. Sometimes it is mistaken for the cracking of ice or the cry of a seabird too far inland to belong. Those who hear it alone at night rarely sleep again without light. They wake convinced that someone close to them is marked, that the raven's wings have passed low above their roof. Others insist that it is not an omen of death, but a plea for remembrance. The Nattravnen, they say, cries because no one remembers the names of those it carries. Its wings, heavy with forgotten souls, seek not destruction, but release. This interpretation changes the story, does it not? It makes of the monster something tragic, a guardian of what mankind would rather ignore. The unspoken griefs, the lost infants, the sins whispered but never confessed. Still, fear clings to the name. No farmer would dare utter it aloud when the wind moans through the rafters. They call it simply the bird or the black one, hoping that humility might spare them its attention. There was one village, it is told, where the Nattravnen was seen at the beginning of 3 consecutive winters. The first year brought a drought, the second, an outbreak of fever. The third, the sea itself rose and swallowed part of the coast. When the survivors rebuilt, they carved crosses into the beams of their homes and hung bells fashioned from old helm buckles to ward the raven away. No more sightings were ever recorded, but no one forgot. Every culture has its psychopomp, a carrier of souls, a messenger that moves unseen between worlds. For the Danes, the Nattravnen was the dark reflection of this role, a ferryman not of peace, but of those denied salvation. You can see now that the night raven was not merely a monster. It was a construct of grief and faith colliding, a myth shaped by theology and the unbearable loss of children. It gave darkness a reason, and sorrow a symbol. To speak of the Nattravnen is to speak of a society wrestling with mortality and ritual, where salvation depended not on compassion, but procedure. The myth contained an unspoken question. What happens to those who die too soon for the church to claim them? Perhaps the story endures because that question never lost its power. Even now, it lingers beneath our religious and moral certainties, reminding us how close despair lies beneath devotion. The Nattravnen exists at that crossroads, between heaven and earth, mercy and punishment, mourning and forgetting. It is both the echo and the unanswered prayer. Some versions of the story soften it, describing the Nattravnen as a guardian watching for the souls of infants so they are not entirely lost. Others darken it further, saying it hunts those who sin through neglect. And in both versions, the idea of guilt persists. It is not the raven that chooses its victims. It is the living who create it through their failures and fears. Under the Gothic vaults of Danish folklore, the Nattravnen thus spreads its wings again and again, whispering of the fragile covenant between humanity and the divine. Break it, and the sky itself will remember. In Danish literature and oral tradition, echoes of this belief still glimmer. Children are told tales not of punishment, but of caution, to remind them that every life must be protected, every name spoken into memory. If the Nattravnen comes, it carries not malice, but a ledger. Each name unspoken becomes one more feather on its back, one more cry in its unholy choir. You can almost pity it then, this immense creature doomed to bear what others refuse to face. Its flight becomes not a warning, but a lament, carrying through the night as a requiem for the forgotten. And yet, beneath that mourning, a quiet command emerges. Protect what is innocent, honor what is lost, speak for those who cannot cry out themselves. The shadow over Denmark is not only a curse, it is a mirror. Where it flies, it reflects our own responsibilities, our own silences. The legends tell us that evil needs not hatred to grow, it needs only neglect. So when the wind rises again over the heaths and the church bells echo through storm-torn air, remember the giant night raven that once ruled Danish skies. Remember that behind its terrible beauty lies the oldest truth of all, that every shadow begins with light. Before the next chapter turns towards its fearful anatomy, the wings that devour the moon, consider this moment of breath between stories. For by watching the darkness more closely, perhaps we may yet learn to see our own reflection within it. And if this journey into Denmark's haunted night has taken hold of you, linger a moment longer beneath our channel's wing. Subscribe. Join the circle of listeners who seek meaning in the unseen. And tell in the comments which ancient creature you wish summoned next into our whispering dark. The fog drifts like a living thing, curling over the marshes of Denmark until it seems to breathe. Somewhere above that slow-moving shroud, something enormous stirs against the night, its movement so vast that even the clouds recoil. Those who have seen it say the first sign is not sound, but absence. The world grows hollow for a moment. No wind, no insects, not even the murmur of the sea. Just a darkness that feels too deliberate to be alone. Then, from the void, a shape unfolds. Two massive wings spread wider than the roof of a barn, their motion deliberate and ancient, sweeping open like the slow turn of an eclipse. The Nattravnen's feathers are so black, they do not reflect the light of stars or flame. Each plume seems to consume rather than shine, drinking every glimmer until even the moon fades and the world is drenched in shadow. If you were standing beneath it, you would feel the pulse of its wings like a storm held in silence. The air would strain against your lungs, not from speed, but from the sheer pressure of its unseen presence. What hides beneath those feathers is stillness incarnate. Villagers speak of seeing the Nattravnen glide past their homes without stirring a single breeze, its vast body unaffected by the raging wind that follows. It moves not like a bird, but like a concept made flesh, the embodiment of what cannot be escaped. Its descent feels less like flight and more like the slow closing of a cosmic lid over the living world. In its design lies the poetry of horror. The wings, immense and perfect in symmetry, form an arch that seems to mirror the gates of heaven turned upside down. As it passes overhead, its outline bends the light itself, a shadow with depth and weight. Some legends claim its feathers are lined with ash from every unblessed grave, each plume carrying a memory of an infant's first cry that never turned into laughter. The creature thus becomes a living reliquary of sorrow. To see it is to be reminded of everything humanity has buried without farewell. The blackness of those feathers absorbs not only light, but repentance. It swallows the prayers that could have freed the forgotten dead. The peasants told of sleepless nights when the bird lingered above their roofs, its wings covering whole streets in darkness. Even candlelight seemed afraid to burn, bowing to the absence it carried. Some saw that spreading darkness as the literal shadow of damnation, cast over the land to test its faith. Others believed it was protection, the raven covering the guilty from divine judgment, hiding them under its mournful shroud. You can almost picture it against the vast Scandinavian sky, wings outstretched in impossible stillness. the moon fades behind its silhouette, as though consumed by the enormity of a grief too deep for mortals to bear. Few dared to look up when storms rolled across the coast at night. The lightning, they said, would catch in its wings, glowing faintly between feathers like the fire of distant souls. To gaze upon that glow was to invite death within a fortnight. Fishermen would return early from sea when the heavens burned with unnatural hollowness. They claimed that the bird fed on moonlight itself, draining the night until stars dimmed and tides roared with rage. This hunger of darkness became symbolic, the soul's terror of being forgotten, the fear that nothing holy remains when the light fades. The Nattravnen was born of this dread, not simply as a warning, but as embodiment. There are tales of travelers frozen in place, unable to run as the shadow passed overhead. They heard the whispered rush of wings and felt warmth leave their bodies, as though life itself hesitated to remain in such company. When dawn came, there would be no marks left behind. Only dead birds scattered in circles, their eyes wide open, tiny victims of a force they could never comprehend. The people saw this as proof that even bowed in obedience. The Nattravnen's eyes are spoken of in tones both reverent and fearful. Two red orbs that smolder rather than shine, moving independently like beacons searching through sin. Each is said to contain countless trapped faces within its fire. In one tale, a child once looked upon those eyes for too long and fell into seizure, claiming later to have seen an endless sky filled with crying infants. When she awoke, she spoke with a voice not her own, asking for baptism she never received. No priest dared to place water on her brow. Some said that by uttering those words, the Nattravnen spoke through her, a desperate attempt to cleanse the curse through mortal tongue. Theologically, the creature holds a strange duality. It is both predator and overseer, blasphemy and benediction. The wings that swallow the moon are at once symbols of despair and of purification through suffering. For the superstitious, this paradox produced rituals of fear and faith mingled. Mothers drew crosses over their children's beds. Fathers carried silver trinkets blessed in secret masses, hoping the black wings would pass them by. In more remote corners of Zealand, elders performed midnight vigils, standing in fields to recite psalms against the dark. They left offerings of milk for lost souls, believing that compassion might free the beast from its eternal hunger. But even mercy could not lighten its flight. The Nattravnen remains forever suspended between grace and punishment, an angel exiled from heaven's gates for crimes it never committed. No depiction of it exists that captures its enormity. Medieval woodcuts show only fragments: the curve of a wing, a burning eye, a streak of night over a church steeple. Each artist appeared to lose nerve before finishing the full form. Perhaps they understood something the rest could not. To describe what devours the moon is to describe the unknowable. One cannot draw infinity or sorrow. They can only surrender to it. Yet the persistence of the myth reveals its necessity. Every age finds its own way to see the limits of light, to question what endures when beauty fades. The Nattravnen's form offered a language for that unanswerable longing. Those wings became a mirror for human isolation, spreading across centuries as both ghost and theology. In their shadow lies a meditation on what it means to lose the divine thread and drift into night. Picture it now soaring over old Denmark, a vast and silent cathedral in motion. Snowdrifts fall through its transparent feathers as though gravity itself forgets its purpose. The roar of thunder follows miles behind, too delayed to belong to this world. The raven moves in a rhythm older than storms, a creature that remembers the night before God spoke light into being. Some scholars of faith later softened the telling, describing the wings as metaphors for abandoned virtues. Charity forgotten, innocence unguarded, prayer unspoken, each wingbeat a tally of humanity's neglect. Whether metaphor or monster, the image remains unsettling. To imagine black wings closing over the moon is to accept that creation itself harbors silence deeper than sound, guilt deeper than sin. In the heartbeat after its passage, silence does not merely return, it expands. The world seems remade in grayscale. Even color waits for permission to exist again. If you found yourself there, in that hollow moment beneath its path, would you pray or simply listen? Some say the wise do both, for prayer gives words to fear, but listening teaches reverence. Over centuries, the night raven's form merged with others of the northern imagination. Some connected it to Odin's ravens, mistaking Hugin or Munin for its ancestors, though their natures could not be more different. Those birds of thought and memory fly by day, bearers of divine wisdom. The Nattravnen flies through storms, burdened with memories too painful for the gods themselves to carry. It marks the other side of knowing, the price of remembering what mercy cannot erase. To gaze upon it is to witness the balance of creation tipped toward reckoning. In Danish folklore, to describe its wings was an act of confession. Each tale adjusted its texture. Some said smooth like silk, others rough like burnt leaves. But all ended the same way, with silence, with awe, with fear. Every storyteller lowered their voice when reaching the moment of its appearance. The silence between words became part of the myth, echoing the silence that falls when wings block the light. So much of its terror lies not in attack, but in erasure. The wings erase stars, wind, and even thought, leaving behind only the raw pulse of existence. To encounter it is to realize how small we are in the vast ledger of death. Some believe its wings beat once for every soul forgotten that day. Others believe each beat creates new shadows where none existed before. Either way, its passage reshapes the night itself. In this way, the creature becomes painter and priest, redeemer and devourer. The dark space beneath its wings is the unlit temple where grief kneels before awe. And though centuries have softened its outline, its legend has not lost its weight. The Nattravnen still lives in dreams born of guilt, showing humanity the texture of the space between heartbeat and silence. If you ever walk the Danish coast on a moonless night and find the world suddenly breathless, look to the sky. If the light above seems to vanish rather than fade, you may be standing beneath the old omen itself. Do not speak, do not move. Wait until sound returns to the world. Only then may you count yourself among the living once more. What creature could hold such paradox in its wings, at once death and devotion, punishment and grace? The answer waits within the darkness we fear to name, within the silence that follows the last bell's ring. As we journey onward, we will descend deeper into its origin, into the wound of faith that gave it birth. For in understanding the beginnings of the night raven, we may begin to glimpse the human heart behind its shadow. There is a silence more terrible than thunder, the silence of a child who never cried. In the old Danish villages, that silence filled the air like smoke, clinging to doorways, to cradles, to the hearts of mothers who could not forget. Death was a constant companion in those winters, creeping like frost through the thatched roofs and smoke-stained chimneys. Many infants never reached their first dawn, their tiny breaths fading before the priest could utter holy words. In that loss, the people searched for meaning, for a reason behind the unbearable stillness. The church taught them that baptism was the gateway to salvation, the sacred boundary protecting a soul from eternal wandering. But what of the ones who died before the rite could be performed? What of those whose parents, isolated by snow or storm, could not reach the chapel in time? These unanswered questions grew into dread, and dread into myth. The Nattravnen was born from that dread, the collective cry of mothers who could not save their children. Its body, they said, was formed from the spirits of these unbaptized innocents, lost between the mercy of heaven and the shadow of nothingness. They were not evil children, only restless ones. Their souls sought warmth, and in their seeking became tangled together, merging into the vast anatomy of grief that took wing over Denmark's night sky. Unlike the saints, whose souls ascended in light, these were drawn downward, tethered by the sorrow of those who mourned them. Over centuries, the story solidified. A single monstrous bird composed of countless unlamented cries. Its feathers were said to whisper the names that were never given. Each plume carried the echo of a baptism never performed, a ritual promise left unfinished. Flying through storms, the Nattravnen carried an entire nation's forgotten prayers. The elders told of nights when the storm's voice changed timbre, weaving through the thunder the sound of weeping infants. It was said that if one listened too long, one could hear the soft plea for water. Holy, pure, denied. In these moments of terror and pity, humans glimpsed the face of their own neglect. The myth became less a warning of supernatural wrath and more a mirror held up to conscience. Some versions told that the unbaptized souls did not come together willingly. They were gathered by an unseen will, an ancient force of equilibrium that turned abandonment into form and flight. The raven's creation, therefore, was an act of divine retribution and divine sorrow interwoven. In its core burned the conflict between Christian doctrine and pagan instinct. The Old Norse held beliefs in life force lingering close to earth, shades that needed proper rites to find peace. Christianity offered salvation through ritual, not remembrance. The two collided in the making of this myth. Each wingbeat of the Nattravnen carried that theological tension, the weight of a people caught between faiths. They feared the creature, yet they also pitied it, recognizing in its lamentation the depth of their own guilt. Some of the oldest rural hymns mention a dark bird flying low during christenings, circling the church spire as if drawn by the holy voice. The priest would raise the baby high and ring a small bell, not only to bless, but to drive away those lost souls seeking entry. It wasn't hatred that drove them away, but despair. The Nattravnen sought what it could never receive, hovering at the threshold between salvation and exclusion. Each baptism below was both salvation for one and torment for many. There is something indescribably tragic in that vision. A sky filled with beings yearning for grace, condemned to roam until time itself forgets them. Their union became the monstrous guardian of their own sorrow. The parents who lost a child often performed small rituals at midnight. They placed a cup of water at the window, whispering prayers into the dark. They believed the lost would drink from it and find peace before sunrise. But if by dawn the water was disturbed, if frost had melted unevenly or the wind had moved the curtains, superstition declared it already too late. The child had joined the raven's fold, wings now woven with its endless night. As you imagine those scenes, dim candlelight flickering over the wooden cradle left empty. You can sense why this legend persisted. It explained what could not be born, transforming senseless death into cosmic consequence. In this vision, God was both merciful and distant, while the raven became the intimate shadow of divine absence. Its vast shape stretched across the faith of a people still learning what heaven demanded. It is said that each storm accompanying the Nattravnen carried the voices of those souls. The thunder spoke as a chorus of mourning, while the lightning symbolized divine anger striking through compassion, a celestial argument etched into the sky. One storyteller described the Nattravnen's chest as hollow, filled with the sound of beating wings that were not its own. Inside its heart, thousands of little heartbeats pulsed in unison, each belonging to a soul searching for warmth. When the bird passed overhead, dogs howled and church bells shook in their towers. The sound was indistinguishable from wind until one realized that the wind was crying names long erased by history. The myth grew darker still when whispers arose of the creature's mission. It was said to collect new souls each time a child died without blessing, swooping down invisibly to gather them beneath its wings. The act was neither benevolent nor cruel. It was maintenance, a cosmic balancing, ensuring that no soul wandered alone, even if it meant being forever bound to the night. A few villages spoke of the Nattravnen as having once been beautiful, its feathers gleaming like onyx under the celestial light. But when the first unbaptized child cried with no reply, that shine was scorched away. What remained was void. Thus, the creature's darkness became emblematic, a kind of reverse halo that carried all heaven's negations within it. To look upon it was to confront the blank page of divinity, the question of mercy itself. In this, the legend aligns with countless myths of spirits born from human guilt. The Greeks had their laments for children of the gods forgotten by ritual. The Celts, their banshees mourning premature death. Denmark had its raven. For though the Nattravnen flew above all, it was also a mother's metaphor, a manifestation of grief made vast enough to cross mountains and time. Every child it carried was a note within a requiem that never ended. Some insisted the creature could be redeemed through compassion. If one dared stand unafraid as it passed and whispered a prayer for all forgotten souls, the Nattravnen would hesitate in its flight, shudder, and drop a single black feather. That feather, when found, was said to hold unimaginable weight. Carvers would place it on altars as proof that pity could reach the unreachable, even if only for a breath. No one ever claimed to see two feathers fall. Mercy, it seemed, was a solitary act. The myth reminds us that compassion is powerful precisely because it does not multiply. It must be renewed through each act of remembrance. Children in later centuries were told that the Nattravnen perched on the steeples during storms to wait for the souls rising from churchyards. To hear its call was not a curse, but a vigil. The dead calling to be seen, not shunned. This change in tone reveals the resilience of the human heart. Over time, terror turned to empathy, and the raven's wings became symbols of mourning rather than menace. Yet the fear never vanished completely. That dual awareness, the pull toward horror and pity, remains at the myth's core. The Nattravnen is terrifying because it embodies what faith cannot resolve: the innocent punished by chance. Even theologians quietly debated its meaning, crafting sermons that spoke of the lost little ones whom Christ would not forget. But no sermon reached as far as the cry of the wind, no dogma as deep as the cries in the storm. To this day, some elderly Danes still pause when thunder rolls above the fjords. They touch their brow and murmur a blessing, not for fear of death, but for acknowledgement, to assure the unseen children that they are remembered. There lies the lesson of this chapter. Every myth arises from a wound that refuses to close. The Nattravnen is not simply a monster born of fear, but the echo of compassion too long delayed. When we name it, we confess our shared guilt, the souls we forget, the prayers we neglect, the silences we build into walls. To retell this legend is to open those walls again, allowing grace to breathe through the cracks. And perhaps that is why the raven still flies. It endures not to punish, but to remind, carrying within its endless flight the soft breath of those who never spoke their first word. Their silence becomes our responsibility. So if you ever feel the wind hesitate before a storm, or the faint cry of something ancient breaks across the rain, pause. Offer your thought not to fear, but remembrance. The living redeem the lost each time they care to remember. In the next chapter, we'll face the full gravity of its presence, not merely as a legend of sorrow, but as a harbinger of consequences. For the Nattravnen does not wander without purpose. Its flight marks the coming of death and the measure of repentance that follows. It begins with a stillness so unnatural that even the animals fall silent. Somewhere above the twilight fields of Denmark, the air trembles with an invisible weight, and before the first thunderclap can be heard, the people know. The Nattravnen has awakened. Its presence is not seen at first, but felt, like pressure building around the heart. A scent of rain and ash fills the air, mingling with the heavy sweetness of soil turned by the wind. Something vast is moving, though no sound of wings breaks the sky. When it arrives, it does not descend swiftly. It glides low, almost grazing the tops of houses and trees, its enormous span blotting out the stars. The moon disappears beneath its silhouette, leaving only the glimmer of two crimson eyes that burn like omens across the night. The people have long believed that this sight is the first sentence of their fate. The Nattravnen is not a creature of chaos, but of certainty. It does not choose its victims. It marks them, a signature written in shadow over roofs and roads. In every legend, its call precedes calamity. The sound is not that of a crow or raven, but something deeper, resonant like wind moving through a hollow grave. The peasants say it hums through the bones, as if death itself were tuning the body for departure. When it cries, the living stop what they are doing. Fires die mid-flame, and even the oceans seem to hold their breath. It is a sound that stretches across distances, crawling into villages separated by mountains, yet united in fear. In the oldest tales, the call came in three echoes. The first for those soon to be ill, the second for those already fading, the third for the soul being carried away. To hear all three before dawn was to know that death had already chosen a home. Storms are its favored hour. As black clouds roll over the flatlands, lightning illuminates the edges of its colossal wings. There, for a heartbeat, one might see faces in the feathers, sad, screaming, pleading, before they vanish into dark. Farmers working late in the fields would throw down their tools and run for their homes at the first roll of thunder. Mothers pressed children to their chests, whispering prayers to drive the omen away. But prayers rarely reach the sky in time. In one story, the Nattravnen circled a coastal village for 7 nights. On the 8th, the sea rose without warning and swallowed every boat in the harbor. Those who survived claimed they had seen the bird perch upon a church steeple, its eyes reflecting the lightning like prophecy. In another, a farmer's wife heard the cry of the raven above her house just before her husband collapsed at dinner, bread still in his hand. She buried him 3 days later and never spoke the bird's name again. Such stories multiplied because fear does not need proof. It only needs memory. Each retelling stitched the myth deeper into the landscape until the Nattravnen and death were indistinguishable from one another. To say the raven came was the same as saying death walked among them. Yet few believed it cruel. It was an herald, not a murderer, a divine courier delivering the word no soul wishes to hear, but every soul must one day receive. The way it flew, slow, deliberate, inevitable, mirrored the approach of mortality itself. No haste, no malice, only the steady rhythm of destiny unfolding over the living. Whenever plague swept through the land, the people swore they had seen it first. Its black wings flooded their dreams, expanding across the sky just before symptoms appeared. The pestilence that followed was said to be carried in its shadow. Priests cautioned against looking at the sky during such times, warning that the gaze itself could mark a person. For if the Nattravnen met your eyes, it would recognize in you the silence of the grave waiting to be filled. Sailors feared it most. On the Baltic, where the fog thickened into curtains of ghostly gray, they claimed the raven would glide silently above their masts. If its shadow touched the sails, they ripped within hours, and storms devoured them whole. These patterns of omen reinforced the creature's mythic power. Whether true or not, the fear it inspired shaped behavior, prayer, and even superstition itself. People learned to measure life not by hope, but by the intervals between the raven's visits. The Nattravnen's presence warped reality. Dogs refused to bark, cows stopped producing milk, and infants cried without tears. Whole villages felt the paralysis of anticipation, a communal dread that could last days before fate fulfilled what the raven foretold. It was said that only the ringing of bells could drive it away. Their resonant hum cut through its silence like a blade of light, forcing the creature to retreat to the clouds. But the reprieve was temporary, the warning merely postponed, never denied. This fragile defense gave rise to new customs. During storms, churches kept their bells ready even at midnight. Watchers posted in towers with ropes wrapped around their wrists. The sound that rang out then was wild and desperate, echoing across miles of open land, as if the whole country cried aloud against the void. Still, no one mistook this as triumph. The people understood they were not frightening the raven. They were reminding heaven they still remembered how to pray. When the bird withdrew, the silence left behind was immense. Its absence did not feel like safety, but suspension, as though the world itself had delayed a verdict. So when death came afterward, it felt almost merciful, an end to the waiting more than life itself. The Nattravnen's relationship with death was intimate, not antagonistic. It was described as the envoy of balance, ensuring that the boundary between breath and stillness remained respected. To see it was to witness the moral architecture of the universe at work. Villagers often argued whether its call mourned or celebrated its victims. Some heard sorrow in its note, a tone so low it trembled through the soil. Others swore it laughed, an endless, echoing croak of satisfaction at the fulfillment of mortal design. Perhaps both were true. The duality of the Nattravnen reflected the duality of death itself, dreaded by the living, but necessary for a cosmic order too vast for human comfort. In the hush that followed its flight, people spoke softly of the souls carried on its wings. They imagined their lost loved ones passing through that endless darkness, like travelers through a tunnel, guided by the cry that once terrified them. Only the living experienced fear. For the dead, the raven was a companion, gentle in its guidance, grave in its certainty. To them, its wings were not darkness, but passage, not doom, but closure. This is what makes the Nattravnen unique among Europe's many omens of death. It does not chase the living to torment, but to prepare them. It stands as an intercessor, not between heaven and earth, but between denial and acceptance. Yet its pity is cold and faceless. The creature does not discriminate between king and beggar, child or elder. The moment its shadow touches you, you belong to the story it tells, a story written long before your birth. Perhaps that is why, even now, the myth preserves its gravity. The modern world may no longer fear omens, but the human heart still trembles at the unknown rhythm by which endings arrive. If you close your eyes during a storm and listen deeply, you may hear what our ancestors heard. A low vibration in the wind, a hum without source. It may be imagination or memory, or something older than both, echoing through time. And if you feel the hair rise at the back of your neck or the air grow suddenly cold, remember the lesson they lived by. The Nattravnen does not come for cruelty, but for truth. It shows us the line between fear and surrender, reminding us that mortality is not a punishment, it is a passage. Before dawn breaks, the cry fades, slipping into the rumble of thunder and the rustle of leaves. Life resumes, fragile but conscious. Someone will die before sunset, someone else will be spared. Yet all will glance at the horizon one more time, wondering what the sky remembers that they do not. Like the toll of a distant bell, the Nattravnen's warnings linger within each of us. A voice that neither condemns nor saves, only announces. Its gift is perspective, delivered in terror. As we turn toward the next chapter, we will leave behind the foretelling of death and follow those who once stood beneath its shadow. We will listen to the witnesses whose eyes met the night raven and lived to tell its story, their voices trembling between faith and madness. There is a strange courage in those who claim to have seen the Nattravnen. It is not the courage of warriors or saints, but of people who survived an encounter that seemed to borrow breath from another world and leave them forever marked. Their stories are written in trembling hands, recorded in church margins, or whispered in candlelight. They differ in detail, yet all share the same hollow cadence of truth, the sense that something unearthly had once looked back at them from the night. The first recorded sighting comes from an old fishing village near Ribe in the southern marshlands. There, an entire family swore they saw the black wings unfurl over the tides during the winter storms that followed a poor harvest. The father, a man named Esben, described the creature as so colossal that its wingtips brushed the waves. It flew low across the sea, avoiding the lightning as if guided by a purpose deeper than survival. He recounted that its cry did not pierce the air. It drowned it. The sound was thick and sorrowful, as if the ocean itself were mourning. Within 3 days, a fever spread through the village, leaving behind empty boats and silent homes. Those who buried the dead claimed to hear wings in the wind each night until spring, though no shadow ever returned. This story became the village's grim inheritance, told from parent to child as a reminder that grief must never be ignored. Farther north, in Skagen, a painter traveling through the dunes described seeing an immense bird rise from the sand one night while sketching the moon. Its feathers shimmered like oil, and its red eyes reflected the fire from his camp. He wrote that the creature did not threaten him, but observed him with a weight that silenced his thoughts. When he blinked, it vanished, leaving only black feathers scattered over the dunes that crumbled into dust by dawn. That same month, a storm wrecked half the fishing fleet along the coast. Survivors told of a vast shadow that passed over their ships moments before the waves turned against them. None dared speak its name until they reached shore. Elsewhere, in a quiet inland village of Jylland, a schoolteacher named Thora Jørgensen reported that the Nattravnen visited only in her dreams. In them, she stood inside her classroom as the walls dissolved into mist and the sky filled with beating wings. The bird told her nothing, yet she woke each time to the news that someone from the village had died overnight. By the fourth dream, she stopped sleeping, keeping candles lit to hold back the dark. Her health failed before the following year. Her final entry in her journal spoke only of listening to the wind for voices that once learned their letters beneath her breath. Some say her grave remains untouched, its soil never quite settled. These stories, raw and human, gave form to the myth's endurance. The Nattravnen was no longer only a cosmic symbol, but a participant in human tragedy, a creature whose silent flight mirrored the quiet suffering of everyday mortality. Among farmers, it became a calendar of death. If a cow was found lifeless in its stall or a field withered overnight, they said the raven had flown that way the evening before. The pattern was unmistakable: darkness first, sorrow after. One old shepherd swore that he saw the Nattravnen resting atop a chapel roof during a thunderstorm. When lightning flashed, he caught its eyes glowing through the rain. He fell to his knees, whispered a psalm he could barely remember, and in the morning found his flock untouched, but his wife gone cold in bed. No one doubted him. They only lowered their voices when he walked by, unwilling to speak of what had chosen him to witness the divine sorrow that others only feared. Fishermen often claimed that the creature avoided lighted harbors, but circled unlit coasts where no bell could ring. They took this as a warning and began carrying lanterns shaped like small crosses to hang from their masts, believing that even a flicker of faith could keep the raven away. For generations, these acts of fearful faith became part of Danish life. The Nattravnen's terror thus built traditions of protection, sound, light, prayer that blended superstition with devotion in equal measure. But not all witnesses spoke of horror. A midwife in Funen told her daughter that she once saw the raven perched atop a churchyard tree after delivering a stillborn child. The creature did not move. It simply watched as she wrapped the infant and placed it before the altar. Instead of fear, she felt something close to empathy, as if the enormous presence wept with her in silence. The next dawn, the clouds cleared, and she swore she heard the faint ringing of a bell, though none nearby had sounded. Her descendants carried that account as a sign that the Nattravnen was not pure evil, but a collector of grief, a spirit that bore witness when no one else could stand to. Thus the story acquired tenderness amid the dread, showing the raven as both mourner and messenger. A more disturbing tale emerged later from Copenhagen during a smallpox outbreak in the 18th century. Writers accounted that the creature was seen hovering above the city spires, wings stretching from church to harbor, while the smoke from pyres blurred the sky. The frightened said its feathers dripped midnight over rooftops, marking each house that would lose a child. Within weeks, the disease claimed hundreds, and the people buried them beneath bells that rang until their ropes frayed to threads. When the epidemic passed, an eerie calm settled. Artists painted the raven in frescoes over cemetery walls, towering, solemn, eyes cast downward, not in malice, but mourning. In them, it became less a tyrant than the embodiment of sorrow itself. Decades later, another account surfaced from an army camp stationed near the German border. A young soldier wrote to his sister that he saw a massive bird circling the trenches before battle. It made no sound, but every man who saw it turned pale and crossed himself. That night, the wind changed direction, scattering their torches. By morning, disease had swept through the camp, claiming dozens before a single bullet was fired. The survivor ended his letter with the words, "The bird already counts us." He never wrote again. These testimonies stretch across centuries, yet their pattern remains constant. Appearance, silence, calamity. The Nattravnen's visits served not as random horrors, but as reminders woven into cultural memory that suffering always leaves shadow behind. Psychologists might call it a collective metaphor, a way of personifying inevitable loss. But to the ones who heard wings over their roofs at midnight, there was no metaphor, only presence. To be chosen as a witness was burden, not honor. Villagers believed these witnesses carried part of the raven's vision afterward. Their dreams darkened, their eyes aged. Some lost their voice entirely, able only to hum the mournful tone that echoed after its passing. Out of reverence, they were treated gently by their neighbors, given food and prayer out of gratitude and pity alike. The people saw in them walking proof that heaven's messengers could leave marks no earthly doctor could erase. This reverence endured well into the 19th century. Folklorists visiting rural regions often remarked that during storms, old men would stare at the sky rather than hide, muttering that the raven needed listening ears so it would not be alone. Perhaps in some deep, instinctive way, they understood that fear itself is only half of faith. To witness the Nattravnen was to accept one's smallness before the eternal, to see mortality rendered in feather and shadow, and still bow the head in respect. Across the decades, variations appeared. Some claimed the night raven could take smaller forms, splitting into flocks of ordinary crows whose chorus replaced its single call. These lesser birds landed on windowsills as ambassadors of its will. If one tapped on your window 3 times, you were expected to keep a candle burning until dawn. The gesture was symbolic, a sign that even when darkness watched you, you would return its gaze with light. The boundary between superstition and spirituality blurred completely. Priests condemned the belief, yet quiet villagers continued the practices, because even a forbidden ritual was better than helpless waiting. In modern Denmark, echoes of these traditions survive under the guise of folklore festivals and bedtime stories. Yet for those who study or record the mythology, the tone always falls back into respect rather than fantasy. The witnesses taught that some myths remain alive precisely because they refuse to comfort. They do not end with salvation, but with endurance, the courage to see the face of the unknown and keep walking forward. There is an unspoken pattern in all these stories. After each sighting comes silence, then loss, then rebuilding. The land remembers by repetition, and in that repetition, the myth regains its wings. Perhaps that is why the Nattravnen still commands a place in Denmark's collective soul. It is not only feared, but revered as memory incarnate. A reminder that to live is to witness, to love is to lose, and to tell the story is to make meaning out of both. Soon, we will explore this deeper role, The raven's task beyond omen and witness, its place as guide between this world and the next. For in the next chapter, the Nattravnen will descend into its truest identity. The dark psychopomp, ferrying souls forever suspended between redemption and oblivion. Beneath the thunder-laden sky, the Nattravnen assumes its truest form, not merely as omen, but as a keeper of thresholds. The Danes once whispered that the bird does not fly aimlessly. It patrols the borders between worlds, ensuring the condemned find their passage, while the living remain tethered to the earth. Its wings, vast enough to veil the heavens, do not beat for travel, but for judgment. With each silent stroke, the creature moves through unseen corridors of spirit, collecting what cannot enter sanctified ground. Where priests could not tread, the night raven's sword. In old sermons murmured through fear, it was called the gatekeeper of the unshriven. It waited not at church doors, but in the cold beyond them, where prayers fell short and souls wandered in confusion. To those cast out of grace, its shadow was both punishment and mercy. No soul too corrupt, no death too defiled evaded its reach. Soldiers slain without confession, suicides buried apart, infants unbaptized, all were said to fall within the raven's dominion. It gathered them, not in hatred but in duty, a spectral warden of cosmic order. The people imagined its flight as a crossing, a bridge of feathers unspooling over black water. On one shore, the living knelt in grief. On the other, the forgotten waited, huddled like stars dimmed before dawn. The raven's journey connected them. Its arrival was not an intrusion, but a silence descending upon chaos. When souls cried too loudly, it appeared to quiet them. When the dead lingered among the living, its shadow swept through the fields, sweeping them toward the beyond. Yet this role brought no redemption to the creature itself. For every spirit guided onward, another cry clung to its feathers, another echo merged with its endless lament. The Nattravnen bore the weight of humanity's neglect, its sorrow older than any church bell. Some theologians of the medieval age pondered whether it served God or something older. They spoke of a hierarchy unseen, in which even angels of light required balance. Agents of darkness tasked with duties too mournful for paradise to acknowledge. The raven, they argued, was such an agent. Not evil, not holy, but functional, an instrument of the universal rhythm where life and death exchange whispers through the veil. It carried no love, yet also no cruelty, only inevitability embodied. This interpretation changed the way people feared it. They stopped imagining it as predator and began to see it as custodian. Under this understanding, its visits became less personal condemnation and more collective ritual, the sky performing its liturgy of endings. When plague struck, priests secretly invoked the Nattravnen within their prayers, asking it to bear the suffering of those who died alone. In their hidden words, they conceded that not all mercy bore wings of light. Some must wear darkness to complete the balance. In folk imagery, the raven's passage is drawn like an eclipse moving across the land. Behind it follows an unbroken trail of quietude. The dead finally still, the grieving finally able to breathe again. Death, once terrifying, becomes structured. People began to bury the unbaptized closer to crossroads, believing the Nattravnen would find them sooner. Crossroads were the maps of spirits, the intersection between directions and destinies. The bird was said to rest on those spots between flights, its body merging with the blackness of the night sky itself. Travelers sometimes encountered such stillness. They would walk through a fog so dense that footsteps muted entirely, then smell iron in the air. a metallic echo of life departing. If they turned, they might see nothing, but their shadows would ripple against the ground as if wings passed overhead. Farmers told of hearing their cattle stir for no reason, staring toward the hills as if something immense had just glided past unseen. The silence afterward did not frighten them. It assured them that the raven had done its work. In human imagination, justice often requires a face. The Nattravnen became that faceless sentinel, the proof that no soul, however cursed, was abandoned entirely. It punished through isolation, only to deliver through completion. Its cruelty was the precondition of peace. Songs emerged describing its route, as though by mapping its invisible flight, people could chart their own deliverance. One ancient verse spoke of the raven's wings brushing the stars, shaking loose motes of light that became newborn souls returning to Earth's cycle. This belief enfolded grief in continuity. It meant that even condemnation contained promise, that the night could birth the dawn. Thus, the raven's role transcended terror. It became a theology of transformation, whispered through feathers soaked in storm. But not all found comfort in this thought. Some feared that the Nattravnen's task blurred too easily into predation, that in its ceaseless labor, it had forgotten how to distinguish the condemned from the ordinary lost. It collected by instinct now, sorrow having become hunger. Tales tell of villages waking to find graves unrested, soil turned as if stirred by massive wings. Bells rang through the night, and the air trembled, yet no lightning flashed. Come morning, the graves lay flattened again, their markers tilted as if in reverent apology. What did this mean? To those who believed, it signified that the raven had visited not for punishment, but for inventory, counting the souls of the restless, ensuring none had escaped into the whispering dark. The psychopomp, after all, must know every passage. In death rituals across northern lands, balance required enumeration. Each soul lost, unaccounted for, threatened the entire spiritual order. The Nattravnen, they said, was the auditor of sorrow. Sometimes children were told that lightning storms were its way of opening doors between heavens. Each flash was the edge of its wing catching divine fire. Each thunderclap the tolling of a gate slammed shut behind another departing spirit. In this way, the myth carried cosmic grandeur. The raven as mechanic of existence, operating silently where gods could not be seen. Its duty was not to decide fate, but to enforce it. A feathered sentinel patrolling eternity's borderlands. Yet the image of the condemned and their gatekeeper grew heavy with paradox. How could one pity what devoured grace for sustenance? How could one hate what freed the forgotten from purgatorial wandering? Each legend answered differently, each colored by the generation that told it. In times of war, the Nattravnen's shadows seemed to expand. Soldiers watching bonfires in the distance often claimed its silhouette crossed the smoke, marking the fallen silently. They said its cry resembled flutes from far away, a lullaby for the dying. Villagers later found feathers near battlefields and burned them as charms against haunting. The ashes mixed with salt were kept by widows who sprinkled them over thresholds to ensure their loved ones reached peace without delay. These small acts of faith mirrored Denmark's dual temperament, pragmatic yet mystical, fearing God but bargaining with ghosts. The raven became the language through which people negotiated mortality itself. Away from war, during the plagues and winters, it maintained its rhythm. The priests claimed that if one paid attention, the flock of the living aligned with the pace of the raven's unseen wings. The seasons changed with its flight. Lives began and ended to the same inaudible pulse. This belief instilled humility. It reminded the people that life was not random but orchestrated, its conductor neither benevolent nor cruel but absolute. Even kings bowed before that unseen order, knowing one day their names too would echo beneath its wings. Philosophers later framed it as a study of balance, the shadow acknowledging the light. The raven, they argued, was no villain but a function, the universe acknowledging its debt to the dead. Only through collection could renewal begin. But the folk held deeper stories beyond doctrine. They said that in rare moments, when moonlight fell just right, one could see smaller ravens rise from the great wings and drift upward like sparks. Each represented a soul released, atoned, forgiven, or simply complete. This fleeting vision became a prayer among mourners, recited not in words but in gesture. The faithful would spread their arms when lightning pierced the clouds, mimicking wings, offering their own fear into its endless flight path. Over time, the Nattravnen stood not opposite divinity, but alongside it, a complement in the grand design. Where angels of light gather the blessed, it gathers the burdened. Both carry, both deliver, both dissolve the boundary between worlds. To accept its existence was to accept imperfection in creation itself. The Danes learned through the raven that redemption may not always gleam. Sometimes it rustles through storm clouds, unseen yet ceaselessly working. Even now, travelers speak of the ancient energy that lingers in Danish nights during rainfall. A hum below thunder, a rhythm beyond the human heartbeat. They say it is the mark of the gatekeeper still honoring its covenant, still flying its eternal route. And perhaps this is mercy, disguised in abyssal form. For without such a keeper, the restless would have no escort, and grief would wander eternally through the living. The Nattravnen claims them not to damn, but to conclude. Its law is both cruel and kind. Every soul must find its way home, even if home lies in shadow. The creature fulfills what priests and prophets cannot, proving that darkness too has its ministry. So listen carefully when the thunder pauses, when the world seems to inhale between lightning's breaths. You may hear the faint stirring of feathers across infinity, the whisper of a gate opening somewhere unseen. That is the Nattravnen at work, still faithful, still infinite, still keeping watch. In the next chapter, the story will descend back to earth, to those who tried to hold back this force through faith and ritual. Their fragile protections offer glimpses into humanity's desperate need to bargain with the divine, even against the wind of fate itself. Even in the blackest hours of Denmark's winter, humanity would not surrender entirely to the shadow. Against the vast dominion of the Nattravnen, people raised small, trembling lights. Rites of protection fashioned from faith, fear, and the stubborn will to endure. The cross stood as their first defense. Carved in rough wood or traced hastily in air, it was less a weapon than a plea. The people believed that in the sign's geometry lay divine order, a shape the raven could not cross without fracturing its own purpose. At the heart of every village stood a church whose steeple pierced the fog like a defiant finger pointing to heaven. From there hung the bells, their bronze throats prepared to shout against the silence that followed the raven's flight. When storms gathered above, men were stationed by the ropes, their hands blistered and ready. Each toll was more than sound. It was spirit turned to vibration, a pulse of the human will against cosmic despair. The ringing of the bell did not banish death, but reminded it that the living still remembered their maker. Old traditions dictated specific rhythms: 3 tolls to ward off an approaching storm, 7 to shield the newborns, and 9 to commemorate the departed. These numbers possessed no magic alone, yet belief forged power where explanation faltered. The Nattravnen's visits often began with storms that silenced these bells. Wind strangled their cords, or lightning cracked towers in half. Still, the moment repair was possible, new bells were forged, heavy enough that their first ring shook the air with vengeance. Across Denmark, bell founders became artisans of salvation. Their forges glowed like sacred hearts, tongues of iron shaped into sound meant to outcry the wail of the raven. Every note was a promise. This village has not abandoned the light. The cross, however, bore more complexity. It was not merely symbol, but motion, a gesture performed with trembling precision at the first whisper of wings. Parents taught children to trace the sign over their doors, livestock, and cradles at dusk. If the creature's cry echoed close, they drew it slowly, a vertical stroke for life and death, a horizontal one for mercy and fate. The movements were deliberate, embodying courage even as fear gnawed at their bones. These simple acts bound communities in invisible thread. Belief, more than wood or metal, became the true protection. The ritual itself declared, "We cannot overpower the darkness, but neither shall we bow to it." In regions near Aarhus and Finn, candles took on protective significance. Families lit them at windows facing west, believing light could redirect the raven's path toward the sea. Only 1 flame per house was permitted. Excess brightness was seen as pride that might provoke celestial testing. Thus the land glowed faintly during tempests. Tiny golden eyes glittering through the mist, defiant stars reflected upon the earth. The raven, they said, avoided such sight, for its wings carried the weight of oblivion that could not mingle with warmth so human. Yet some legends told of times when even these protections faltered. Bells melted in lightning, crosses cracked, candles drowned in wind. During those nights, when no human gesture endured, it was said that the raven itself hesitated, its massive body circling over darkened villages as if reluctant to complete its duty. This hesitation gave rise to the notion that pity dwelled even within the Nattravnen's heart. The creature, forged from unbaptized sorrow, still recognized the fragile beauty of resistance. It lingered not to torment, but to witness. Thus, every bell and cross echoed double meanings, both shield and conversation. Each act of defense addressed the raven not as enemy, but as counterpart, acknowledging that both sides shared origin in the same eternal struggle between loss and memory. The chants that accompanied these rites were subdued, half spoken, half prayed. In certain places, they began with the phrase, "Let the sound find its twin in heaven." The people hoped that for every chime below, an answering tone might rise above. Mothers guarding their children would weave charms of thread dyed with ash and salt, knotting them 9 times while murmuring psalms. These cords hung over cradles as bridges of intention, fragile but sincere, symbols that life would not be surrendered without remembrance. When storms grew fierce, priests walked from house to house, carrying censer smoke that mingled with the scent of sea and candle wax. Each movement was both ritual and reassurance, reminding the living that even God's silence did not mean abandonment. The cross, the bells, and the light. Together, they formed a trinity of hope against despair. The peasants knew none of these could kill the raven, but that was never their purpose. The rituals existed to remind the participants that courage could still sing even in trembling notes. There are accounts of one remarkable night in Zealand when lightning had splintered every bell tower. The villagers, left without their sounding guardians, gathered on the cliffside with lanterns raised toward the roaring sky. They stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a glowing line between earth and sea. The raven appeared then, its wings blotting half the horizon, its cry a dirge that seemed to drag the air itself downward. Yet, as it descended, its glow met the sea of human lanterns, the small, steadfast constellation of living will. It turned and vanished into storm. No one claimed victory that night. They knew none could exist. Yet the ocean calmed, and the village endured. For generations afterward, those lanterns were lit at the same time each year, a quiet remembrance of defiance through unity. The power of these customs was psychological as much as spiritual. Every toll of the bell synchronized heartbeat with faith. Every flicker of flame mirrored the collective refusal to vanish. Through repetition, fear became reverence, and reverence became resilience. It is easy now to dismiss these acts as superstition, but they held profound meaning in eras where life's boundaries were dictated by uncertainty. The rituals made chaos tangible, translated terror into action. A sacred alchemy of mortality turned into motion. Over time, even city dwellers adopted muted versions of these rites. Candles were replaced with electric lamps, prayers with quiet moments of reflection when thunder rolled outside apartment windows. The instinct remained the same, the need to push back, however gently, against the heaviness of unseen things. In this continuity lies the genius of folklore. Where the institutions of power sought to reason, myth sought to feel. And through feeling, it kept the people human, tethered to compassion amid incomprehensible forces. The cross reminded them of order beyond fear. The bells bound them in unity, their shared echo linking human voices across distance. The light embodied persistence, the refusal to surrender perception itself to dark. Even the Nattravnen, they believed, understood these gestures. Its flight paths curved around the region's most faithful, not from defeat, but from respect, as though the creature recognized that where light endured, its own sorrow would find no purchase. And so protection became dialogue. Faith became conversation. Between each toll and wind gust, between each trembling candle flame, there was understanding. The darkness yearned for acknowledgement, not invocation. This paradox became the hidden heart of the myth, that to drive away fear completely would also erase its wisdom. The Nattravnen existed to teach vigilance, humility, and the sacred fragility of life itself. Each act of ritual thus carried a second purpose: to remind the living that protection without remembrance is void. The bells must not ring from habit. The cross must not be traced without intention. These gestures mattered because they were alive. In time, the rituals became metaphors for moral vigilance. Parents would tell their children, "Keep your bell pure, your cross steady, your light clear." They meant not literal objects, but conscience, the sacred instruments that hold chaos at bay within the mind. Perhaps that is how traditions survive, by transforming from defense into philosophy. The people realized that even when no raven darkened their skies, there were still shadows within the heart that required ringing and light. And so the legend of the Nattravnen, once confined to superstition, evolved into symbol. Its haunting became education. Its menace became meaning. Every tool once lifted in defense turned into a reminder of moral clarity. Still, something ancient stirs whenever thunder rolls over Danish coastlines. Churches vibrate slightly as if their bells remember past duties, and the wind through rafters carries echoes that could almost be feathers brushing air. Though centuries have passed, villagers still light candles during storms without knowing why. The flame flickers in ancestral rhythm, a dialogue spanning time, human uncertainty answering cosmic silence once again. In this way, the cross, the bells, and the light remain eternal companions against oblivion. They do not end the night, but they articulate it, turning fear into form, trembling into testimony. Through them, humanity proclaims, softly yet defiantly, that remembrance is stronger than despair. In the next and final chapter, we will gather these symbols and shadows into one reflection. The raven as mirror of myth and man, its dual wings still unfolding the eternal story of wisdom and death intertwined. Beneath the immense Scandinavian sky, where cold air bends sounds into strange echoes, the legend of the Nattravnen settles into quiet reflection. Its wings no longer sweep across the world as terror alone. They exist now as symbols, each feather carrying both memory and meaning. The raven's story, told for centuries, is not merely the tale of a beast, but of the human heart mirrored in darkness. To understand it fully, one must stand at the threshold it guards and see how fear transforms into understanding when viewed through the lens of myth. Every civilization creates guardians of liminality, creatures who dwell between order and chaos. The Nattravnen is Denmark's own, a sentinel watching over the fragile balance between mortality and grace. It separates the known from the unknowable, with wings that stretch across theology and dream. Its presence endures because it embodies contradiction. It is at once a child of sin and of sorrow, a symbol of both punishment and compassion. To speak its name is to admit that death is not a boundary, but a conversation between worlds. In the sagas of old, ravens were threads of divine intelligence woven through the mortal realm. Odin's companions, Hugin and Munin, flew across creation to bring him knowledge and memory. They were harbingers of wisdom, their black feathers glittering with truth rather than doom. The Nattravnen, however, bears none of that serenity. Where the ravens of gods bring enlightenment, this raven brings confrontation. It reminds humanity of what it chooses not to remember. The suffering left unredeemed, the innocence left unacknowledged. In this contrast lies a profound symmetry. Hugin and Munin ascend as daylight, bearing the mind of divinity, while the Nattravnen descends as twilight, carrying the weight of neglected grace. Together, they form a cycle, one feeding the intellect of the gods, the other nourishing the conscience of men. Thus, the raven becomes both mirror and measure. It asks, silently, whether humankind can face its own reflection without retreating into denial. The more we fear it, the clearer its purpose becomes. The myth whispers that wisdom and death are not opposites, but branches from the same root. The raven is that root visible above the soil, dark yet vital, born from the same earth that feeds all light. In understanding its darkness, one touches the truth of life's fragile design. In Danish folklore, this duality extends beyond symbolism. The Nattravnen is depicted perched upon ancient gravestones, not as desecrator, but as watchman. Its shadow stretches over the names carved in stone as though to shelter them from the erosion of forgetting. Here lies the creature's paradoxical mercy. It defends memory even as it terrifies. To encounter it is to stand within a sermon of silence, taught not by priest or prayer, but by presence alone. Over the centuries, scholars and storytellers alike reimagined its meaning. They began to call it not just the night raven, but the sorrow of Denmark, a spirit wrapping the nation's collective grief in plumage so dense that daylight could never fully disperse it. Yet it also became, subtly, a figure of preservation. Each retelling salvaged something sacred from the void. Through its terror, communities learned gratitude. Through its flight, they found proportion between awe and humility. The Nattravnen's role as psychopomp thus expands beyond the spiritual. It becomes an ethical metaphor, reminding listeners that to ignore suffering is to invite its manifestation. The raven's cry echoes the question: what happens when collective guilt takes physical form? And therein lies the myth's most human element. The creature does not create evil. It carries it. It absorbs what societies bury, what hearts cannot confess. Its wings are archives, each feather a record of forgotten compassion. To understand the raven is to understand consequence. Every culture builds walls between purity and sin, heaven and earth, forgetting that their stones bleed into one another. The Nattravnen flies over those boundaries without effort, exposing them for what they are: illusions against mortality's tide. When lightning illuminates the sky above the Danish plains, tradition holds that the raven's shape still appears in the clouds. Some interpret this as omen, others as echo. Both are true, for myth survives by reproducing itself within the imagination of each generation. The feather's blackness contrasts not with light, but with our limitation to perceive it fully. In its darkness lies infinite detail, the unseen merging of what the living reject and what the lost remember. The more one stares into it, the more one perceives reflections of their own fears returning from within. Such myths evolve because humanity evolves. The Nattravnen that terrified peasants under storm clouds is not the same one whispered of today in literature or art. Now it stands as metaphor for collective intimacy with loss, the solemn recognition that death, in its quiet honesty, is the most faithful of companions. The raven's dual shadow stretches not only over Denmark, but over all cultures conscious of impermanence. Every story of a banshee's lament, a reaper's presence, or a ghostly messenger echoes its cry. Each culture dresses the fear of mortality in the feathers of its own imagination. What sets the Danish legend apart is its intimacy. The Nattravnen is not a cosmic destroyer, but a local mourner. It belongs to the soil, to the barns and shorelines, to the churchyards where candles flicker against sea wind. It teaches not terror of death, but reverence for remembrance. This intimacy teaches humility. The raven reminds us that mortality is not punishment, but natural choreography. It dances where breath ends, closing the circle without malice. The creature's flight writes across the heavens the same question every mortal heart holds. What will endure of us when the wind moves on? If one listens closely, the answer is already within the legend itself. The Nattravnen endures not through fear, but through retelling, each storyteller a guardian of its wings. In this way, memory becomes its true immortality. Light and darkness coexist in its mythic body. The red eyes of the creature, once interpreted as fury, now resemble embers of compassion, burning, perhaps painfully, but eternally alive. Its gaze demands truth, not destruction. To the modern mind, the tale retains relevance precisely because it refuses simplicity. It reflects the contradictions of faith and reason, offering no salvation without introspection, no dread without meaning. The raven's silhouette becomes our collective philosophy, curved across the sky. Even mirrors it. Real ravens still thrive across the Nordic lands, their calls harsh yet intelligent. Observers cannot help but see in them fragments of mythology, alive in feather and bone, fragments of ancient symbolism reframed as ecology's persistence. Wherever one finds them, they remind us of what myth always sought to express. Nattravnen, that life does not vanish, but migrates between forms. Just as the Nattravnen carries souls through unseen passages, too does memory ferry our identities through time's relentless storm. There is poetry in this symmetry. The creature that once embodied condemnation now symbolizes continuation, a tale reborn each night that thunder speaks through the clouds. Even silence seems different after its telling, thicker, fuller, aware of presence just beyond comprehension. In that silence rests the unity of opposites. Wisdom cannot exist without death's patience. Compassion cannot flourish without the memory of sorrow. The Nattravnen is both tutor and tomb, teaching through loss the sanctity of remembering. For all its shadow, the myth ends not in darkness, but in awareness. It tells its audience that confronting mortality redefines living, that the veil between life and afterlife is not meant to separate, but to contextualize. The Nattravnen, then, is not simply Denmark's harbinger of death, but its philosopher of dusk. It endures as emblem of how humanity transforms fear into form and despair into devotion, preserving fragile truth through story. So, when the next storm rolls over the North Sea and the sky deepens into unbroken charcoal, pause before closing the window. Listen to the low hum that ripples between thunder and silence. Perhaps it is the wind, or perhaps it is the familiar weight of wings circling once more, gathering the voices of the forgotten for one final flight. And if your heart stirs in that moment, it means the myth has done its work. You have remembered not the monster, but the message, that every shadow holds reflection, and every ending hums quietly with beginning. In this final revelation, the Nattravnen ceases to be a creature and becomes a truth. That knowledge and mortality, guilt and grace, fear and fascination all share the same sky. And through its endless journey across that sky, Denmark's giant night raven continues to remind the living that remembrance itself is a form of light enduring forever in the dark.